Like I've said, I try and pay particularly close attention to Elon and everything he says. But I don't stop there. I read or listen to a lot of books. For example, for August so far, I'm above 100 hours listening time on Audible, and that's at 1.3 times speed. I read a lot when it comes to economics, business, and money, and a bit on electricity and energy. However, also a fair amount on world history. I'm then able to take things that Elon says and relate them back to other knowledge sets. Sure, a lot of other people do different kinds of research and are reading tons of articles on Tesla, or researching patents, laws, or even watching a lot of YouTube videos, for example. Everyone has their own way to contribute in their own fields. But a lot of my research does stem from books. Not that I don't also do my best to stay up to date with what is happening with the company and industry. But I spend a lot of my time on Tesla and I enjoy books. I don't watch much TV, and I consolidate my hobby of studying Tesla with my job of reporting on Tesla. However, I also try to read books that Elon is also talking about. Currently, I've been reading quite a bit on civilizations, along with how they collapsed. There have been many great civilizations in history that have achieved amazing innovation. Innovations like the Roman aqueducts or the Egyptian pyramids. And not just the pyramids of Giza, but in other civilizations like the Mayans too. Even though the Mayans didn't manage to invent the wheel or the pulley, however, they also had to do this without the use of horses, as they were not indigenous to South America. Instead, they had llamas. But many civilizations that were separate from one another did evolve to certain stages and would eventually discover innovations like metallurgy, going from bronze, which is tin and copper, to the iron stages. Similar discoveries were found from various civilizations over time. Of course, some civilizations were much further ahead than others, like the Chinese dynasties, who discovered porcelain and silk. These were coveted products by the West, but they had nothing that China wanted to trade with. China was too far ahead and didn't want to trade with antiquated items. However, the British did end up finding something China wanted to trade when they managed to get 10% of the Chinese population addicted to opium, hence the Opium Wars, and why Britain used to own Hong Kong. The way a civilization grows in innovation is actually quite simple. I can say it in one word: peace. The longer any civilization is at peace, the further the innovation can progress. The term Pax Americana is used to describe the peaceful time that America had and how they had innovated. However, there's also a term called Pax Romana to describe the couple of centuries of relative peace the Romans also experienced and saw such great innovation. The faster innovation increases, though, is through freedom. The more freedom people have in a safe civilization, then the more creative they become, and thus more innovation occurs. It's not as much to do with intelligence. For example, in China, you have a communism regime, and the civilians are under great pressure to work harder and educate themselves more. As a result, they do tend to have a higher IQ. However, despite a population 4 times higher than the US, they're not innovating at the same rate. Just check how many of the largest companies in the world are American. They don't encourage individualism. And in the Soviet Union, initially they saw a faster rate of growth in GDP than any other nation had in the past. People were starting to think communism is the way, and they even made it to space before America. But this is because the country was industrializing. It was copying the playbook of America and other successful nations, except also able to learn from their mistakes and choose all the best technology for industrializing and leapfrogging old antiquated technologies. But once you're caught up, then where does the innovation come from? Eventually it collapsed. Sure, you can keep growing GDP by making more factories that build shovels, but what happens when other nations start using diggers? How can your nation keep up? And then China has recently done the same, seeing massive growth in GDP by building tons of property, great new roads, high-speed internet, super fast trains. It all adds to GDP, even if it comes from government spending. Minimal regulation in building factories, not so concerned about patents or copyrights, so commerce happens at a much faster pace. And the CCP thought that they had learned from the Soviets and opened up a free market, rather than trying to control price and production. But all this infrastructure and investment in China was not coordinated in free markets with real supply and demand, and you end up getting trains that have very few passengers for some destinations to others, for example. Of course, that's not the real elephant in the room. It's more the property bubble now. Something perhaps reminiscent of what we saw in Japan in the 80s, only not quite to the same extreme. I'm sure you've all heard the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the entire state of California. But did you know that Tokyo alone was also worth more than the entire country of the United States of America? Everyone thought Japan had cracked it. Their technological innovation was out of this world. They thought their GDP would overtake the US. Of course, it was just a bubble. The biggest one that I can think of in total monetary value, and the economy collapsed. Although by some miracle, Japan has been treading water ever since and is not following the traditional economic axioms. Sure, the government owns something like 20% of the Nikkei and funds zombie corporations, but they're still getting by. However, their demographic issues are of much more concern. But maybe China's GDP will overtake the US. It is perhaps just a numbers game, and they have a lot of numbers. But they're running out of the cheap labour they once had in reserve. Subsistence farmers moving into the city for a high living standard, and thus in turn generated a larger middle class. Eventually the labour becomes too expensive and can no longer compete with low international manufacturing prices, although they do what they can to keep their currency low and locked into the dollar. And that's what a good nation is all about, a strong middle class. And this is why America was so successful for so long. They had such a large middle class. Why is the middle class so important, you might ask? Well, because if there's a majority, somewhat egalitarian population, then people are not simply voting for what's best for them individually. Instead, they can vote for what is best for the collective, and it's all best for them. You see, if you have equality from the majority of voters, then you don't have the poor voting for more benefits and welfare, and you don't have the rich voting for lower taxes. You have a majority that can serve their best interest, and rather than voting for a demagogue or populist leader, you end up voting about a future that really matters, on issues that actually make a difference. New Zealand was actually a nation that had a strong middle class and was thus arguably the most progressive country in the world. However, with the current regime, I think that may have come to an end. New Zealand has mounted one of the largest national debts of developed nations due to strict lockdown policies during COVID. Whereas on the other extreme, you have India and their caste system. Too many different classes wanting different things mean you can't agree on a future for the country and will thus continue to struggle. But China does now have a middle class. I think it's possible that the population may hopefully outgrow the government and end up becoming a democracy. I think it inevitable the CCP will collapse. Of course, they've tried in the past with Tiananmen Square, but the government didn't stand for that one bit, and murdered thousands of their own people. The message was clear. You may have a free market now, but don't let that confuse you with actual freedom. Pluralism is another essential element of a nation, which is what the CCP lacks. The first instance was the 21 barons in England to keep the king or queen in check. Some economists think that when China does collapse, it will likely break up China into several different nations. But all great civilizations in the past have eventually collapsed, and there is no reason to think the current empires will be any different. Right now, it looks like we're close to losing currencies. We've debased the currencies in the world too much. It might be too hard to come back from. We may be able to manage it for a period of time, but I'm not sure it's sustainable. When civilizations collapse, it's terrifying. But right now, we've never depended on so much technology and centralization, that if they came to a stop, then a very large percentage of the population would be wiped out, and probably in a short period of time. And it would be much worse than you likely think. TV shows like Walking Dead are more like walking in the park, relative to what could really happen. Along with globalization, something that nations are waking up to, of just how much power some nations have over technology and energy around the globe. Now, all the money printing has created more inflation, and inflation creates inequality. The rich get richer as they have real assets that increase in value. They also tend to back these assets with debt, which reduces in value. You might think Bitcoin is volatile, but it's a lot less volatile than hyperinflation. In Bolivia during hyperinflation, their number one import was the paper to print the money on. People would receive money and immediately buy something with it, like a CD player. Although they were not well off enough to usually afford such items, they had to store the value somewhere, as the next day their money would be worth half as much. Equally, during the war, when money was scarce, people would use cigarettes as a medium of exchange of currency. And perhaps this is what Elon is really doing, preparing us for a potential civilization collapse, although also hoping for the best, but leaving us with what I am coining an intrinsic economy, which is a base economy we're left with in a collapse. We'll have Starlink that will provide ubiquitous internet, communication, information and knowledge across the globe. We'll have solar power, a decentralized form of energy, no longer dependent on oil or gas, or any power plant to keep running. And with electric cars, we have transport that can run on this power generation, so that people can still receive food. I'm hoping that eventually Tesla's HVAC system will also have a way to create clean water for us too, and perhaps we'll have lots of robots to help us where necessary too. If history is anything to go by, a civilization collapse is inevitable, except due to globalization, it will be the entire world, and so much more severe. If during the collapse there is no famine, and thus we do maintain civil and not turn to anarchy, if we still have a medium of exchange to create some form of economy and commerce, then perhaps it can rebuild again without massive amounts of lost knowledge or lives like we've had in the past. Of course, the biggest threat is the possibility of nuclear war, and Elon is trying to hedge that too by colonizing Mars. Thanks for listening. Please hit the thumbs up and remember to subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and talk to me on Patreon.